Ich bin Dorothea Buck.
My name is Dorothea Buck. I am 90 years old and a so-called historical witness. The theme of my presentation is 70 years of coercion in the German psychiatric system, experienced and witnessed. I will start with a forced treatment and forced sterilization that was inflicted upon me 71 years ago. In 1966, Alexander Mitscherlich wrote in his book Illness as a Conflict, Studies on Psychosomatic Medicine, Volume 1, in the chapter entitled On the Complexity of Social Influences on the Origin and Treatment of Psychoses and Neuroses, quote, "From the days of the primitive cultures up to present times, there have always been methods of torment. On closer examination, a terrible arsenal of tortures in themselves." Unquote. This applies also to the present-day practices of restraints and forced medication, despite the fact that much more effective and helpful treatments for schizophrenia, such as soteria and Professor Yrjö Alanon's need-adapted treatment in Finland, have proven their worth for decades. In 1936, 71 years ago, at the age of just 19, I went through the most inhuman experience of my life in a psychiatric institution, against which even being buried alive during the Second World War paled into insignificance. I experienced the psychiatric system as being so inhuman because nobody spoke with us. A person cannot be more devalued than to be considered unworthy or incapable of conversation. What made it worse was the fact that this happened at the von Bodelschwing'sche Asylum Bethel in Bielefeld, which considered itself a Christian institution. Bethel and its director, Pastor Fritz von Bodelschwing, were held in high esteem, thought of as an embodiment of compassion in my parents' home, a parsonage, and by us children. But now I got to experience a totally different Bethel compared to the one I had learned about from the newsletter Messenger from Bethel. On the light green wall opposite my bed, one could read in large letters the words of Jesus, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavily laden, and I will give you rest." How are we to be given rest? With buckets of cold water poured over our heads, with long-duration baths in a tub covered with canvas and a stiff high collar in which my neck was fixed for 23 hours from one doctor's ward round to the next, with cold wet sheet packs, and with sedating injections of paraldehyde. In the case of the cold wet sheet packs, one would be wrapped into them so tightly that one could no longer move at all. Due to the body temperature, the sheets would become first warm and then hot. I would cry out in rage at this senseless restraint in these hot sheets. I just could not believe that the natural way of helping in the form of conversation and occupation was being replaced with these torturous, sedative measures. It was only natural that we got restless without occupation and diversion, without a single conversation, not even as part of the admission procedure, and staying in bed all the time, despite being in good health physically. How were we to recognize this senseless kind of behavior on the part of the doctors and nurses as helping us? These were the methods of Emil Kraepelin, who had lived from 1856 till 1926, that determined our German psychiatry. The medical director of our Hospital for Nervous and Mood Diseases, in Bethel, as it was then called, was one of his last students. Emil Kraepelin replaced the conversations that his predecessors such as Wilhelm Griesinger, 1817 till 1868, and Karl Wilhelm Ideler, 1795 till 1860, had still had with their patients, with a silent observation of symptoms, replacing it with a clinical picture or nosological psychiatry. As a result, he was no longer capable of recognizing his patients as fellow human beings, because that is only possible by speaking with them. The symptoms they observed took the place of the human being with his or her experiences. Kraepelin demanded, quote, a ruthless intervention against hereditary degenerates, the elimination of the psychopathic degenerate, including the use of sterilization, unquote. Thus the director of Bethel, Pastor Fritz von Bodelschwing, demanded the enactment of a sterilization law 2 years ahead of the National Socialist regime at the Protestant Specialist Conference on Eugenics, held from May 18 through 20th, 1931 in Dreisau. He explained his position with the following, quote, destruction of the kingdom of God in this or any generation, so that the possibility or responsibility exists for an elimination to take place. Therefore, I would be apprehensive if sterilizations were only accepted in cases of emergency. I would prefer to see these procedures as a responsibility conforming to the will of Christ. Quote from the minutes. A truly monstrous kingdom of God that granted us only a hopeless and passive custodial state without a single conversation sanctioned by Bible verses. On the other hand, the medical director of Bethel from 1930 to 1933, Dr. Karl Schneider, was opposed to a sterilization law. From the minutes, he considers it an error to assume that what is biologically valuable is also mentally valuable. For example, in patients with manic-depressive disorders, such a high level of social competence tends to be inherited so that it is impossible to sterilize for purely medical reasons. Schneider's conclusion, quote, we know nothing about this issue. We're just drawing conclusions from experiments with animals and plants, unquote. 2 years before the Nazis came to power, Protestant physicians and clergymen were calling for sterilization. Those who are hereditary carriers of social inferiority and needing care should be excluded from procreating if possible. Quote from report. As I asked the ward nurse about the scars that my young female fellow patients had in the middle of their lower abdomens, she explained that these were appendectomy scars. Were we lied to at home when they told us that the appendix is located towards the side? Concealment of the fact that the operation I had been subjected to was in fact a sterilization seemed to be common practice here, even though the Genetic Health Law of 1933 required that those sterilized had to be informed by the physicians about the nature of the procedure. Even after the operation, it was not a doctor or a nurse who told me what had been done to me, but a fellow female patient. I was distraught because people who had had forced sterilizations were not allowed to attend secondary schools or schools providing higher education, and were not allowed to marry a non-sterilized partner. I had to abandon my chosen profession as a kindergarten teacher for which I had prepared myself such a long time, not to mention the lifelong stigmatization as being inferior. In the January 2007 edition of the Deutsche Ärzteblatt, a German medical journal, one finds an article about the absence of compensation of us inferior individuals up to the present day, with the following quote from Professor Werner Fillinger, who was Bethel's medical director from the year 1934 on, taken from a statement he made before a German parliamentary committee for restitution on April 13, 1961. Quote, he presumed to claim that by paying compensation to people sterilized under coercion could now cause real damage. The question arises whether this might lead to the appearance of neurotic complaints and illnesses which would not only hurt their previous subjective well-being and their capacity to be happy, but also their productive capacity, unquote.